Welcome back, fellow seekers, to another journey into the shadows of history and the whispers of the past. I'm your host, Josh, and tonight we are setting our compass south to a city steeped in mystery, magic, and a history as rich and dark as its legendary soil, New Orleans, Louisiana. This is not just a tale of hurricanes and battles, of sickness and fire. It is a dive into the profound moments when fate, nature, and human struggle converged to leave an indelible mark on the Crescent City, shaping its very soul through immense loss. From the streets once consumed by the flames of the Great Fire of 1788, to the strategic swamps where a pivotal battle was fought, to the silent devastation of cholera, yellow fever, and the Spanish flu, and to the relentless winds of Katrina. Each event etched deeper lines into the city's unique spirit, creating a tapestry woven with tragedy and resilience. Join me as we explore these pivotal moments, not just as historical facts, but as chapters in the ongoing saga of New Orleans, where every street, every building, and perhaps every spirit holds a memory of these large-scale deaths. Let us uncover the stories behind the numbers and listen closely for the echoes of those who came before. So grab those drinks, sit back and relax, and join us as we venture again into the unknown. We plunge into the heart of New Orleans, a city synonymous with mystique, a place where history breathes through every cobblestone street and every wrought iron balcony. But before it became the vibrant, haunted metropolis we know today, New Orleans bore the scars of cataclysmic events, moments when its very existence hung by a thread, and few events left as profound and physical a mark as the Great Fire of 1788. Imagine, if you will, the New Orleans of March 1788. It was not the sprawling urban landscape of today, but a compact, bustling colonial outpost, a jewel in the Spanish crown, though its architecture still largely echoed its French origins. The air was thick with the scent of cypress, spices from the docks, and the lingering aroma of rich cooking. Life was lived in close quarters. Wooden structures tightly packed with courtyards and narrow alleys defined the town. It was a vibrant tapestry of cultures, French, Spanish, African, Creole, all woven into the humid delta landscape, a unique melting pot already simmering with its own distinct energy. But beneath this veneer of colonial charm lay a dangerous vulnerability. The vast majority of structures were built of wood, roofed with cypress shingles, and often plastered with a mixture of mud and moss, materials incredibly susceptible to fire. And the city had a chronic shortage of water, its only source being the mighty Mississippi a short distance from the populated core, and a few scattered wells. Firefighting equipment was rudimentary at best. A few bucket brigades, some hand pumps, and the desperate courage of its citizens. The stage was set, unknowingly, for a disaster that would reshape the city forever. The date was March 21st, 1788. It was Good Friday, a day of solemn observance in the devoutly Catholic city. As tradition dictated, all fires and candles were to be extinguished in homes to mark the sanctity of the day. But human error, as it so often does, intervened with devastating consequences. The origin point, an almost mundane detail that sparked such immense destruction, was the home of a Spanish military treasurer, Don Vicente José Núñez, located on Royal Street. Núñez's household, likely unknowingly or through a tragic oversight, left a burning candle unattended on an altar. It was a small flame, easily overlooked in the quiet reverence of Good Friday. But in the dry conditions of that late March day, it quickly found purchase, igniting nearby draperies or wooden furnishings. The alarm was raised, but by then it was already too late. The Núñez home was quickly engulfed, and the fire, fueled by the prevailing winds, began to leap. And here's where the colonial city's architecture became its undoing. The buildings were too close, the materials too flammable. The fire spread with terrifying speed, devouring one wooden structure after another, a voracious beast consuming everything in its path. Imagine the shouts, the screams, the frantic ringing of church bells that quickly became muffled by the roar of the inferno. Panic erupted as families, dressed in their finest for the holy day, suddenly found themselves fleeing for their lives, grabbing whatever precious few belongings they could carry. The official response, though desperate, was tragically insufficient. Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro, the Spanish governor at the time, was horrified. He personally directed firefighting efforts, but the lack of proper equipment, the scarcity of water, and the sheer scale of the blaze rendered their efforts almost futile. Attempts were made to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings, a common, albeit brutal, firefighting technique of the era. But even this proved nearly impossible in the face of the raging conflagration. The flames jumped the gaps, consumed the debris, and continued their relentless march. The fire raged for 5 agonizing hours, from 8:30 in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. New Orleans burned. 5 hours, but in that span, almost the entire city was obliterated. When the last embers finally died down or were beaten back, the scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. An estimated 856 buildings, nearly 80% of the city's structures, lay in ruins. Think about that. Almost everything. Homes, businesses, the municipal building, the armory, the city's prison, the clergy house, and perhaps most heartbreakingly, the St. Louis Church, the spiritual heart of the community, all reduced to ash and rubble. Miraculously, given the scale of the destruction, the loss of human life was relatively low, officially recorded as only 2 people. This astonishing fact is often attributed to the solemnity of Good Friday. Many residents were either at church, which was one of the few buildings to survive, or observing the day quietly at home, making them more aware and able to react quickly to the developing disaster. They had time to flee, even if they lost everything else. The enslaved population, many of whom lived in wooden cabins on the outskirts or within compounds that burned, also managed to escape, likely due to their intimate knowledge of the city's escape routes and the immediate need to save themselves and their families. While 2 official deaths were recorded, the true toll on human lives, particularly among the vulnerable, might have been higher and simply unrecorded, lost in the chaos and suffering that followed. But even with that caveat, the number is remarkably low compared to the physical annihilation. The aftermath was catastrophic. Thousands were left homeless, wandering through the smoldering ruins of what had been their lives. Governor Miro, to his credit, acted quickly and compassionately. He ordered tents to be erected, food and provisions distributed, and secured temporary shelter for the displaced. He even arranged for the immediate shipment of building materials from nearby regions and initiated a public collection to aid the victims. His response was a testament to effective, albeit desperate, leadership in a time of profound crisis. But the lasting mark of the Great Fire of 1788 extends far beyond the immediate suffering and the relief efforts. It literally and physically reshaped the face of New Orleans. When the city was rebuilt, it was done so under Spanish rule and with strict new building codes. No longer would wood be the primary material. Instead, new structures were mandated to be built with brick, with thick stucco over the brick, and with tile roofs, materials far more resistant to fire. This is why, if you walk through the French Quarter today, despite its French name, the architecture is predominantly Spanish colonial. Those iconic iron balconies, the stuccoed walls in vibrant colors, the enclosed courtyards, these are the direct legacy of the 1788 fire, a testament to a city literally rising from the ashes, reborn in a new architectural style. Furthermore, the rebuilding effort offered an opportunity for urban planning. Streets were widened, fire lanes were established where possible, and a more organized grid emerged from the chaos. The St. Louis Cathedral, destroyed in the blaze, was rebuilt on a grander scale, becoming the architectural masterpiece that anchors Jackson Square today. The Cabildo, the city's impressive colonial government building, also rose from these ashes, as did the Presbytère. These grand structures, now iconic landmarks, stand as permanent markers of the city's transformation. This devastating fire also had profound social and economic impacts. Many wealthy families who had fled the inferno found their fortunes wiped out, their investments literally gone up in smoke. The enslaved population, having survived the blaze, faced the daunting task of rebuilding a city that still denied them freedom and equal rights, yet they were crucial to its reconstruction. The economic lifeblood of the city, heavily reliant on trade and port activities, was severely disrupted, though the resilience of its merchants quickly worked to reestablish commerce. The Great Fire of 1788 serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human settlement in the face of nature's fury and human oversight. It is a tale of near total annihilation, followed by a meticulous, determined rebuilding that forever altered the city's visual identity. It is a historical event that infused New Orleans with a deeper layer of history, a physical and spiritual rebirth that continues to resonate today. The ghosts of those burning wooden structures, replaced by the enduring brick and stucco, are still present in the very fabric of the city. Now, let us shift our gaze from the relentless forces of nature to the equally devastating yet profoundly human theater of war. We journey now to the fertile plains just outside the city, to a moment when the destiny of New Orleans, and perhaps the young American nation itself, was decided in a bloody, bewildering confrontation, the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. To truly grasp the significance of this battle, we need to understand the larger conflict that birthed it, the War of 1812. For years, tensions had simmered between the burgeoning United States and Great Britain. Issues like maritime rights, impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, and British support for Native American tribes resisting American expansion in the West all contributed to a growing resentment. America, still a young republic, felt its sovereignty challenged and its dignity insulted. The war, declared by the U.S. in 1812, was often dubbed the Second War of Independence, a fight to solidify its place on the global stage. By 1814, the war had seen its share of American defeats and victories, but by far the most humiliating moment for the U.S. came in August when British forces burned Washington, D.C., including the White House and the Capitol. This act sent shockwaves across the nation, highlighting its vulnerability. With this psychological victory under their belt, the British turned their attention to a new, strategically vital target, New Orleans. Why New Orleans? Well, think of it as the ultimate prize. At the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans controlled the entire river system, the vital artery for trade and communication for the burgeoning American territories, stretching all the way to the Great Lakes. Whoever held New Orleans held the economic key to the American heartland. For the British, capturing the city would not only cripple American expansion, but also provide a powerful bargaining chip in peace negotiations, potentially allowing them to demand significant territorial concessions. For the Americans, losing New Orleans would be a catastrophic blow, threatening the very unity of their young nation. The British assembled a formidable force under the command of Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, a distinguished veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. His army consisted of battle-hardened veterans, many of whom had fought against Napoleon's forces in Europe, including the elite 43rd Light Infantry and the 95th Rifles. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and considered among the finest soldiers in the world. They sailed into the Gulf of Mexico, intending to strike a decisive blow. Opposing them was a motley crew led by the enigmatic Major General Andrew Jackson. Jackson, a fierce frontiersman, Indian fighter, and future president, was known as Old Hickory for his toughness and unyielding will. But his army was anything but conventional. It was a bizarre yet uniquely American amalgamation. Regular U.S. Army soldiers, Tennessee and Kentucky militiamen, many excellent marksmen but with little formal training, free men of color from New Orleans, Choctaw warriors, and perhaps most famously, a contingent of pirates and privateers led by the infamous Jean Lafitte. These disparate groups were tasked with defending the city against a professional European army. It was, frankly, an improbable scenario. The British began their advance on December 23, 1814, landing troops southeast of the city. Jackson, ever the aggressive commander, launched a daring night attack to harass the British and gauge their strength. This skirmish, though inconclusive, bought him precious time. He immediately began fortifying a defensive position just south of the city along the Rodriguez Canal, a dry canal stretching from the Mississippi River to a cypress swamp. His engineers and soldiers, joined by enslaved people pressed into service, worked feverishly, digging trenches and building ramparts from earth and cotton bales, an improvised fortress that would soon become famous. Over the next few weeks, there were smaller engagements and artillery duels, but the main confrontation was yet to come. Unbeknownst to both sides, the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the War of 1812, had already been signed in Belgium on December 24, 1814. Communication was slow, however, and the news would not reach New Orleans for weeks. Thus, one of the most decisive battles in American history was fought after the war had technically ended. The fateful day was Sunday, January 8, 1815. A thick fog blanketed the field in the early morning hours, adding an eerie, supernatural quality to the impending clash. Pakenham, confident in his seasoned troops, planned a frontal assault on Jackson's well-entrenched lines. As the fog began to lift around 7 a.m., the British advanced. What unfolded next was a military disaster for Pakenham's forces. Jackson's men, sheltered behind their earthen ramparts, unleashed a withering hail of fire. The Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, expert hunters and marksmen, picked off the brightly uniformed British soldiers with chilling efficiency. Wave after wave of British soldiers advanced, only to be cut down by musket fire and artillery grapeshot. Pakenham himself, riding bravely at the head of his troops, was struck by grapeshot and killed. Other high-ranking British officers were also killed or wounded, throwing the command into disarray. The disciplined lines faltered, then broke as the soldiers, facing an impenetrable wall of fire, retreated in chaos. The main battle lasted a mere 30 minutes. In that astonishingly short span, the British suffered staggering casualties. Their forces were virtually annihilated on the main field. The official numbers are chilling. British casualties: over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties: a mere 71 killed, wounded, or captured. The discrepancy in casualties is almost unbelievable and speaks volumes about the effectiveness of Jackson's defensive strategy and the marksmanship of his men. The battle was a resounding, almost unbelievable victory for the Americans. The aftermath was grim for the British. Their shattered army withdrew, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The subsequent weeks were spent negotiating prisoner exchanges and tending to their horrific toll. For New Orleans, the battle meant salvation. The city had been spared occupation and potential plunder. The lasting mark of the Battle of New Orleans on the city and indeed the nation was immense and multifaceted. First and foremost, it instilled a profound sense of national pride and unity in the young United States. Coming after the burning of Washington, D.C. and the ignominious end of the war, this decisive victory was a balm for the American psyche. It proved that America could stand up to the mightiest empire in the world and win. Andrew Jackson became an instant national hero, a legend whose popularity would eventually propel him to the presidency. For New Orleans, the battle cemented its place as a crucial American city. Its strategic importance was undeniable. The multi-ethnic, multicultural defense force, including Creoles, African Americans, and Native Americans fighting alongside white Americans fostered a brief but powerful sense of shared identity and purpose, even if these alliances were fleeting in the broader context of a still divided nation. The battle became a foundational myth for the city, a symbol of its resilience and unique spirit. The economic ramifications were also significant. With the Mississippi River secured, the agricultural produce of the vast American interior could continue to flow freely to market, ensuring the prosperity of New Orleans as a port city and fostering westward expansion. Without this victory, the trajectory of the American economic and territorial growth might have been very different. The Battle of New Orleans was not just a military victory, it was a cultural and psychological triumph. It solidified America's independence, united its disparate peoples, and ensured the future of New Orleans as a vibrant, indispensable part of the Union. It reminds us that even in the chaos of war, unexpected alliances can form, and the will of a determined few can alter the course of history in a single bloody hour. We have journeyed through fire and the roar of cannons, witnessing how New Orleans faced overt destruction and rebounded with architectural and national pride. But sometimes the most insidious threats are the ones you cannot see, the ones that creep silently through the city's veins, striking indiscriminately and leaving a trail of devastation unlike any battle or blaze. Next, we turn our attention to one such invisible foe, a scourge that gripped New Orleans in 1832, the cholera epidemic. Imagine the New Orleans of the early 1830s. The city was booming, a bustling port at the crossroads of American commerce and international trade. Steamboats chugged up and down the Mississippi, bringing goods and people from the vast American interior, while sailing ships arrived from distant European and Caribbean ports. The population was exploding, a vibrant mix of French Creoles, Spanish descendants, American settlers, free people of color, enslaved Africans, and a steady stream of new immigrants, particularly Irish and German, drawn by the promise of work and prosperity. It was a cosmopolitan hub, brimming with life, ambition, and, unfortunately, a perfect breeding ground for disease. Sanitation, by 19th century standards, was rudimentary at best. The city was built on a swamp, below sea level, with a high water table. Drainage was a constant challenge. Streets were often unpaved and muddy, and open sewers were common. Human and animal waste often found its way into canals, stagnant pools, and even the shallow wells that many residents relied on. The Mississippi River, while the lifeblood of commerce, also served as the ultimate dumping ground for much of the city's refuse. The understanding of germ theory was still decades away. People believed diseases were caused by miasma, bad air, or imbalances in the body. This combination of dense population, poor sanitation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of disease transmission created a ticking biological time bomb. The arrival of cholera in North America was part of a terrifying global pandemic, the second of its kind. Originating in India in 1817, it had swept across Asia and Europe with deadly efficiency. By 1832, it had reached the shores of the United States, first appearing in New York and then rapidly moving through the major cities along trade routes. It was a disease of shocking speed and severity. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, ravaged by violent vomiting, debilitating diarrhea, and rapid dehydration. The body would turn blue-gray, the eyes sunken, the skin cold and clammy. A horrifying transformation that struck fear into every community it touched. So how did it arrive in New Orleans? As a major port city, it was only a matter of time. The prevailing theory, and one supported by later epidemiological understanding, points to infected individuals arriving on steamboats or ships from infected regions. The disease first made its official appearance in New Orleans in late October or early November of 1832. It did not sneak in quietly. It erupted with brutal force. The first cases were reported among the transient populations: sailors, dock workers, and particularly the newly arrived immigrants, who were often living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions near the waterfront. From these initial points, the disease spread like wildfire. The city's poor drainage system meant that contaminated water was easily distributed. When the Mississippi River, the source of much of the city's drinking water, often consumed unfiltered, became contaminated, the epidemic reached truly catastrophic levels. The disease did not discriminate by class or race, though it disproportionately affected the poor and enslaved, who had the least access to clean water, sanitation, and medical care. The scenes in New Orleans during the height of the epidemic were horrific. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, and makeshift infirmaries were set up in public buildings. Doctors, most of whom had no effective treatment, tried their best with remedies like calomel and bloodletting, which often did more harm than good. The sheer speed of the disease meant that undertakers could not keep up with the dead. Coffins were in short supply, and bodies were often buried in mass graves, sometimes without proper identification. The city became a place of fear and despair. Business came to a standstill, and those who could afford to fled the city, hoping to escape the invisible killer. The epidemic raged for several intense weeks, peaking in late November and early December of 1832. In a city with a population of approximately 50 to 55,000 residents, the 1832 cholera epidemic claimed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 lives. Think about that for a moment. Close to 10% of the entire population wiped out in a matter of weeks. To put that in perspective, this was a higher mortality rate than many major battles of the era. The lasting mark of the 1832 cholera epidemic on New Orleans was profound and multifaceted. Firstly, it forced a grudging, though slow, recognition of the need for public health infrastructure. While germ theory was not yet understood, the pattern of outbreaks made it clear that sanitation, clean water, and proper waste disposal were crucial. Over time, this led to improvements in the city's water supply and sewage systems, though these changes were gradual and often met with resistance. The epidemics spurred the establishment of public health boards and the collection of vital statistics, laying the groundwork for modern public health practices. Secondly, the cholera outbreaks alongside yellow fever, which we will cover next, cemented New Orleans' reputation as a dangerous graveyard city, particularly for newcomers. This grim moniker impacted immigration patterns and led to a unique cultural response to death and disease. The practice of above-ground burial, for example, often attributed to the city's high water table, gained even more significance as mass burials became a stark reality, making individual dignified burials a precious commodity. Culturally, the recurring epidemics undoubtedly contributed to New Orleans' unique relationship with the supernatural and death. When death is a constant, sudden, and seemingly arbitrary presence, it can foster a deeper connection to spiritual beliefs, folklore, and the concept of a veil between worlds. The spiritual practices of voodoo and other Afro-Caribbean traditions, already strong in New Orleans, may have found new resonance as people sought meaning and protection against incomprehensible forces. The idea of restless spirits, of the thin place where the living and the dead intertwine, would only be reinforced by such widespread, inexplicable death. The 1832 cholera epidemic was not just a historical event. It was a visceral experience of terror and loss that permanently etched itself into the collective memory and physical landscape of New Orleans. It taught the city about vulnerability, forced it to confront its own mortality, and in doing so, forged a resilience that recognized the unseen dangers lurking beneath its beautiful, vibrant surface. The echoes of those thousands who perished in 1832, racked by an invisible killer, continue to haunt the deeper lore of this incredible city. Having navigated the hidden perils of cholera, an unseen enemy that stalked the city's unsanitary streets, we next confront an even more infamous specter, a disease so synonymous with New Orleans that it earned the grim moniker Yellow Jack. We are talking about the devastating first wave of the Yellow Fever Epidemic of 1853, a plague that did not just claim lives, but fundamentally altered the very soul of the Crescent City. Imagine New Orleans in the summer of 1853. The summer is at its antebellum peak. America's second largest port, a bustling nexus of cotton, sugar, and enslaved labor flowing through the Mississippi River. The air is thick, not just with humidity, but with a cacophony of commerce, 1,000 different languages, and the restless energy of ambition. Prosperity was tangible, yet beneath the veneer of wealth and vibrant culture, a deadly annual ritual was poised to begin. Yellow fever was no stranger to New Orleans. It had plagued the city for decades, a seasonal visitor that would arrive with the warm weather and retreat with the first frosts. Locals, particularly Creole families who had lived there for generations, often developed some immunity from childhood exposures. But newcomers, immigrants from Europe, fresh arrivals from the northern states, were tragically vulnerable. Each summer brought a new wave of fear, but nothing quite prepared the city for the sheer devastation of 1853. The scientific understanding of yellow fever in 1853 was almost non-existent. Like cholera, it was believed to be caused by miasma, bad air, or poor sanitation. People did not understand that the true vector was the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a tiny, unassuming insect that thrived in the stagnant water of the city's open drains, cisterns, and flower pots. These mosquitoes, once infected by biting a person sick with yellow fever, would then transmit the virus to others with every subsequent bite. The humid, warm climate of New Orleans, coupled with its pervasive water features necessary for daily life and its poor drainage system, created a perfect, unwitting incubator for the disease. The 1853 epidemic did not just start as other years. It exploded. The prevailing theory for its virulence points to an infected ship arriving from the Caribbean or West Indies, likely Havana, a known yellow fever hotspot. The incubation period of the virus meant that sailors or passengers could disembark seemingly healthy, only to develop symptoms days later. Once an infected individual was bitten by a local Aedes aegypti mosquito, the chain of transmission was set in motion. The virus would multiply within the mosquito, and within about 2 weeks, that mosquito became a flying syringe, ready to spread the disease. The first official cases appeared in early May 1853, primarily in the areas around the docks and crowded immigrant neighborhoods, much like the cholera outbreak. Initially, doctors and city officials tried to downplay its severity, calling it acclimation fever or a milder strain. But as the summer wore on and temperatures soared, the cases multiplied with terrifying speed, and the symptoms became unmistakably severe. The disease itself was gruesome. It began with fever, chills, headache, and muscle aches, often mistaken for a bad cold or flu. But then came the more sinister signs: intense jaundice, turning the skin and eyes a ghastly yellow, hence the name. The victim would suffer from severe nausea and vomiting, often spewing a black tar-like substance, the dreaded black vomit, caused by internal hemorrhaging. This was a clear sign of severe organ damage, especially to the liver. Delirium, seizures, and ultimately organ failure would follow, usually leading to death within a week of symptoms onset. The mortality rate for those who developed severe symptoms could be as high as 50 to 80%. The city descended into a living nightmare. As June bled into July and July into August, the number of deaths climbed exponentially. The cries of the sick filled the streets, mingled with the mournful tolling of church bells, which eventually ceased altogether because they rang so frequently that they became a constant, depressing dirge. Coffins became a precious commodity, and undertakers, like during the cholera epidemic, could not keep pace. Bodies were left unattended in homes, and eventually mass burials became a grim necessity. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Medical care was largely ineffective, as doctors tried every remedy, from quinine, effective against malaria, often confused with yellow fever, but useless for yellow jack, to purges, bloodletting, and bizarre concoctions, all to no avail. Many doctors and nurses themselves fell victim to the disease. The sheer volume of the sick meant that many were left to suffer and die with little comfort. Those who could flee did. The wealthy packed their bags and sought refuge in cooler, supposedly healthier climates like Mississippi's Gulf Coast or Saratoga, New York. But the poor, the working class, and the enslaved had no such luxury. They were left to face the plague, their vulnerability compounded by their living conditions and lack of resources. The epidemic lasted for months. Beginning in May, it intensified through the peak summer months, reaching its terrifying zenith in August. It only began to recede with the onset of cooler weather and the first hard frosts of late September and early October, which killed off the mosquito population. In a city with a population of roughly 150,000 to 160,000 residents, the 1853 yellow fever epidemic officially claimed over 8,000 lives. Some estimates push this number closer to 11,000, particularly when accounting for underreported deaths among the enslaved and the poor. To put this in perspective, this was between 5 and 7% of the entire population wiped out in a single season. The death toll was so high that it far surpassed all previous epidemics in New Orleans history, earning it the terrifying distinction of the Great Epidemic, or the Great Scare. The 1853 yellow fever epidemic was not just a medical crisis. It was a crucible that forged a deeper, more complex identity for New Orleans. It showcased its vulnerability, highlighted its unique challenges, and yet, through the sheer force of its people's spirit, the city endured, forever marked by the season the yellow fever ran rampant, leaving behind thousands of unquiet souls and an indelible scar on the city's heart. We have just emerged from the harrowing shadows of 1853, a year seared into New Orleans' memory by the devastating visit of Yellow Jack. It was a season of unprecedented loss, a visceral lesson in the city's profound vulnerability to an unseen enemy. But as anyone who studies history or indeed the paranormal knows, sometimes the spirits do not just leave with the changing seasons. Sometimes they linger, and sometimes the nightmare returns, even more insidiously when you least expect it. We push steadily forward into the period immediately following that catastrophic year, the yellow fever epidemics of 1854 and 1855. These were not isolated incidents, but rather the agonizing aftershocks of the Great Epidemic, proving that once the gates to this particular horror were opened, closing them was a far more complex and terrifying task than anyone could have imagined. Imagine the atmosphere in New Orleans in the spring of 1854. The city had barely buried its dead from the previous year. The wounds were fresh, the grief palpable, and the memory of the black vomit and yellow skin was still vivid in everyone's minds. Despite the recent tragedy, life, as it always does, slowly resumed its chaotic rhythm. The port continued its bustling trade, bringing in goods, people, and unbeknownst to anyone, the potential for renewed contagion. The city tried to rebound, but an undercurrent of anxiety was ever present. The 1854 epidemic, though not as catastrophic in terms of sheer numbers as 1853, was perhaps more psychologically crushing. It served as a brutal confirmation that the Great Epidemic was not an isolated event, but a grim harbinger of a new, horrifying norm. This year, the disease seemed to start with less fanfare, a slow, insidious creep rather than an explosive outbreak. Cases began to be reported earlier, some in April, then more steadily through May and June. The pattern of spread was chillingly familiar, starting in the crowded, often unsanitary areas near the waterfront, and then radiating outward. The poor, the enslaved, and the unacclimated immigrants still without built-up immunity, were once again the primary victims. For those who had survived 1853, the return of Yellowjack was a devastating blow, shattering any illusion of safety. The symptoms were just as gruesome as before. The initial fever, the excruciating body aches, the horrifying black vomit, and the dreaded yellowing of the skin. The lack of effective treatment meant the doctors were still largely helpless, resorting to ineffective and sometimes harmful remedies. The social fabric of the city, already frayed from the previous year, stretched taut. Many more people fled, and those who remained often lived in isolation, terrified of interaction. The 1854 epidemic lasted through the hot summer and into the early fall, much like its predecessor. It was not until the first substantial cold fronts of October and November that the disease began to recede, claiming its last victims as the mosquito population died off. The death toll for 1854, while less than 1853, was still staggering for a city reeling from such recent loss. Officially, a little over 2,000 lives were claimed by yellow fever in New Orleans in 1854. While a reduction from the 8,000 plus of the previous year, it represented another significant blow to a population that had not yet recovered. It was a compounding tragedy, striking at the heart of families and communities already weakened by grief and economic hardship. Then came this year saw another wave, albeit slightly less severe than 1854, claiming approximately 1,500 lives. While the numbers progressively decreased, the psychological impact of 3 consecutive years of widespread yellow fever deaths was immense. It created a pervasive sense of dread and helplessness, transforming summer from a season of leisure into a period of terror. The lasting mark of these successive yellow fever epidemics, particularly the 1854 to 1855 waves, was profound and deeply etched into the city's character. Firstly, they solidified New Orleans' grim reputation as a sickly place, a graveyard of the South for non-acclimated individuals, and the yellow fever capital of the United States. This reputation deterred immigration, intensifying the city's isolation, and made it a pariah for trade and travel during the summer months. This isolation, while devastating economically, also fostered a unique, inward-looking culture, strengthening local traditions and creating a society that had to rely on itself through annual crises. Secondly, the repeated scourges led to increasing scientific and public health efforts, born out of desperate necessity to push for public health reform. While the mosquito connection remained elusive for decades, the intense pressure of these epidemics spurred more rigorous quarantine measures, increased funding for hospitals, often managed by religious orders like the Sisters of Charity, who displayed immense bravery, and a growing, albeit still muddled, understanding of environmental factors. Efforts were made to improve drainage, clean up streets, and develop better quarantine procedures for arriving ships. The city tried everything it could think of, from burning tar in the streets to draining stagnant water, in a desperate attempt to break the cycle. Culturally, the annual summer exodus of the wealthy became a ritual, exacerbating class divisions. Those who could afford to leave did, abandoning the city to the poor, the working class, and the essential laborers who had no choice but to face the disease. This left an indelible social mark, creating a shared experience of vulnerability and resilience, and sense of fatalism among those who remained. The annual threat became part of the rhythm of life, shaping everything from social customs to architecture. The development of enclosed courtyards and screened porches, though not primarily for mosquitoes, did offer some protection. The repeated, seemingly arbitrary nature of yellow fever deaths also fed into New Orleans' already rich cultural and spiritual tapestry surrounding death and remembrance. When thousands die each year from an invisible enemy, the line between life and death becomes incredibly thin. The emphasis on elaborate funerals, second lines, and the deep reverence for ancestors became even more pronounced. The annual return of Yellowjack and its summer ritual of disease and death could only reinforce the belief in a spirit world that was always close at hand, full of restless souls, tragically taken before their time. The yellow fever epidemics of 1854 and 1855 were not just statistical footnotes to the great epidemic of 1853. They were crucial chapters in a prolonged saga of suffering, resilience, and transformation. They took a city already reeling from one disaster and subjected it to a continuous grinding assault, forcing New Orleans to confront its profound vulnerabilities and to forge a unique, defiant spirit in the face of an annual, terrifying death. All right, so we have just journeyed through some truly heavy chapters in New Orleans history, from devastating fires to relentless outbreaks. It is a lot to take in, and honestly, after all that, you might feel a little drained, right? That is where our friends at Debbie come in. While we cannot go back in time to offer the folks of 1788 or 1853 some hydration, we can make sure you are feeling your best as you process these stories. Their energy and hydration powders are a fantastic way to keep your focus sharp and your spirits up, even when the topics get tough. It is all about staying resilient, and a little boost from Dubby can definitely help with that. And if you need a refill, stop in to www.dubby.gg and use code SOULFILES at checkout. That's SOULFILES. So take a quick break, mix up a Dubby, and let us get ready for the next part of our discussion. We near the end of our harrowing journey through the relentless waves of yellow fever that battered New Orleans in the mid-19th century. We have seen the sheer scale of the 1853 Great Epidemic and the soul-crushing follow-up seasons of 1854 and 1855, each leaving an indelible scar. But the story of Yellow Jack in New Orleans is not complete without delving into its final curtain call, the devastating epidemic of 1867. This was not just another outbreak. It was a final gasp of a plague that had terrorized the city for generations, leaving a legacy that would finally push humanity towards understanding and ultimately conquering this unseen foe. Imagine New Orleans in 1867. The Civil War had ended just 2 years prior, leaving the city, like much of the South, in a state of profound upheaval. Reconstruction was underway, a period of immense social, political, and economic turmoil. The city was still struggling to rebuild its infrastructure, its economy, and its shattered social order. Large numbers of newly emancipated African Americans were navigating their newfound freedom in a deeply hostile environment, often living in poverty and crowded conditions. Former Confederate soldiers, displaced and disillusioned, mingled with Union troops still stationed in the city. Poverty was widespread, and sanitation, despite decades of epidemics, remained woefully inadequate. The stage was set, once again, for tragedy. Despite the wartime disruptions, the fundamental conditions that fostered yellow fever had not changed. The Aedes aegypti mosquito still thrived in the warm, humid climate, breeding in stagnant waters. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that efforts to prevent outbreaks were still largely futile, based on incorrect miasma theories. Every summer was a gamble, a tense waiting game, with the city holding its breath, hoping the dreaded disease would pass them by. The 1867 epidemic began much like the others, with initial cases appearing in the spring. There is no single patient zero ship identified as the source, but rather a strong likelihood that the virus had been reintroduced through the continuous flow of maritime traffic from known endemic areas in the Caribbean and South America. The war had disrupted established quarantine procedures, making the city even more vulnerable. As temperatures climbed and the mosquito population exploded, the disease found fertile ground to spread once more. The spread followed the now familiar pattern, starting near the bustling waterfront among sailors, laborers, and transient populations, then moving inward to the more densely populated areas. The poorest neighborhoods, with their crowded housing and lack of proper drainage and sanitation, were hit hardest. But as always, the disease was an equal opportunity killer, eventually reaching all strata of society. The symptoms were classic yellow fever, sudden onset of high fever, chills, severe headache, and backache. As the disease progressed, the characteristic jaundice would appear, turning skin and eyes a sickly yellow. Violent vomiting, often with the infamous black vomit, hemorrhagic gastric fluid, would follow, indicating severe internal bleeding. Many victims also suffered from kidney failure, delirium, and convulsions. Death, often painful and terrifying, usually occurred within a week of symptoms onset for those with severe cases. The summer of 1867 saw the city plunged into a familiar, yet no less horrifying panic. Businesses closed and those who could fled the city, abandoning the sick and dying. The sounds of mourning became commonplace. Undertakers and coffin makers were overwhelmed. Public services struggled to cope. The medical community, still without a cure or a full understanding of the cause, fought a desperate losing battle. Doctors and nurses, many of whom were new to the city and therefore lacked immunity, often became victims themselves. The epidemic raged throughout the summer and into the early fall. It reached its peak intensity in August and September, finally beginning to recede with the arrival of cooler weather and the first killing frosts in late October and November, which decimated the mosquito population. By the time it finally loosened its grip, the city was once again decimated. The scale of death in 1867 was truly staggering, making it one of the deadliest yellow fever outbreaks in New Orleans history, second only to the 1853 Great Epidemic. In a city still recovering from the war, with a population fluctuating around 180,000, the 1867 epidemic claimed an official count of over 3,000 lives. Some historians estimate the true number was closer to 4,000, particularly when accounting for underreported deaths among the poor and newly emancipated communities. To lose so many so soon after the immense losses of the Civil War was a national tragedy for New Orleans. It meant that a significant portion of its population, particularly its working-age adults, had been wiped out, severely impacting its recovery. The lasting mark of the 1867 yellow fever epidemic was profound, and in many ways, ushered a new era for New Orleans. Firstly, and most importantly, it served as a final undeniable testament to the city's extreme vulnerability and the catastrophic economic and social cost of these recurring epidemics. The constant threat of yellow fever was increasingly seen as an impediment to New Orleans' progress and its ability to compete with other American cities. This deep-seated frustration and the sheer scale of the 1867 disaster fueled a more aggressive, scientifically driven push for a solution. While the specific vector, mosquitoes, would not be definitively proven until the early 20th century by figures like Dr. Walter Reed and his team in Cuba and Dr. Carlos Finlay, the 1867 epidemic further intensified the resolve of medical researchers and public health officials to understand and eradicate the disease. Secondly, the epidemic contributed to New Orleans' unique demographic and cultural landscape. The city continually had to replenish its population, leading to a constant influx of new immigrants, many of whom were, tragically, destined to become victims of Yellow Jack. This constant churn, combined with the profound impact of the Civil War and emancipation, created a highly fluid and diverse, yet often deeply scarred society. The experiences of suffering, death, and resilience were woven deeply into the city's complex identity. Culturally, the 1867 epidemic, following so many others, further solidified the city's spiritual response to death. The vibrant, elaborate funeral traditions, the mourning rituals, and the belief in a spirit world where the departed might linger gained even deeper resonance. The yellow fever epidemic, perhaps more than any other single factor, cemented New Orleans' reputation as one of America's most haunted cities, a place where the dead never truly leave. The 1867 yellow fever epidemic was not just the last major outbreak in New Orleans. It was a climactic chapter in a century-long battle against a mysterious, relentless enemy. It was a brutal reminder of humanity's limitations in the face of microscopic threats, yet it also spurred the scientific inquiry that would ultimately lead to understanding and control. The ghostly pale faces, the yellowed eyes, the black vomit. These images would haunt the city for generations, forever embedding the terror of Yellow Jack into the very soul of New Orleans, making it a city where the past and its many departed are never truly gone. We have witnessed the city rise from fire, defend itself in battle, and endure the annual terror of yellow fever and cholera. Each time, New Orleans faced an enemy it could see, or at least one it recognized. But now, we fast forward to a different era, to a new kind of invisible foe that swept across the globe with unprecedented speed and ferocity, reaching even the resilient Crescent City, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. Picture New Orleans in 1918. The city is once again bustling, a vibrant port. But this time, the world is embroiled in the Great War, what would later be known as World War I. Thousands of American soldiers are being deployed to Europe, and New Orleans, with its strategic port and military facilities, is a crucial hub for troop movements, supplies, and returning servicemen. The air is thick with patriotic fervor, anxiety, and the constant movement of people. Sanitation has certainly improved since the days of yellow fever, thanks to a better understanding of germ theory and the eventual eradication of yellow jack by mosquito control. But this new enemy, a respiratory virus, would exploit different vulnerabilities. The Spanish flu, despite its name, almost certainly did not originate in Spain. Its exact genesis remains a subject of debate, with theories pointing to Kansas, military camps in the U.S., or even northern France. It earned its misleading moniker because Spain, being neutral in World War I, had a free press that reported extensively on the illness, while wartime censorship in other nations suppressed news of its devastating impact. This created the false impression that Spain was the epicenter. This was not just another seasonal flu. This was a novel, highly virulent strain of H1N1 influenza virus that attacked the respiratory system with terrifying efficiency. What made it particularly insidious was its tendency to strike down not the very young or the very old, but healthy young adults in the prime of their lives, the demographic least expected to succumb to influenza. This unusual mortality pattern led to an almost mythological fear as it seemed to defy typical disease logic. How did it reach New Orleans? The answer lies in the very arteries of commerce and conflict that sustain the city, its port and its military installations. The virus traveled globally along shipping lanes and, most crucially, with troop movements. As soldiers returned from Europe or moved between domestic bases, they carried the virus with them. The first cases in Louisiana appeared in September 1918, likely introduced through the port or one of the state's military camps. From there, it spread quickly through the urban population. The Spanish flu spread with astonishing speed. Unlike the mosquito-borne diseases or localized cholera, this was an airborne contagion, spread through coughs, sneezes, and close contact. In a densely populated city like New Orleans, where people lived, worked, and socialized in close quarters, the virus found perfect conditions. The symptoms often began abruptly. A sudden onset of high fever, extreme fatigue, severe headaches, muscle aches, and chills. But for many, especially the young adults, the progression was horrifyingly rapid. Their lungs would fill with fluid, leading to acute respiratory distress. Cyanosis, a blue discoloration of the skin due to lack of oxygen, would set in, giving victims a distinctive, terrifying hue. Secondary bacterial pneumonia was common and often fatal. A person could wake up feeling slightly unwell and be dead within 48 hours. New Orleans quickly found itself overwhelmed. Hospitals filled to capacity, and soon makeshift infirmaries were established in schools and public buildings. Doctors and nurses, already stretched thin by wartime demands, worked tirelessly, but they had no specific treatment for the virus, only palliative care. The city imposed drastic public health measures. Public gatherings were banned, theaters and dance halls closed, schools were shuttered, and public transportation often ran empty. Posters urged citizens to wear masks, practice good hygiene, and avoid crowds. The epidemic unfolded in waves. The initial wave in the spring of 1918 was relatively mild, often mistaken for a common cold. But the second wave, the one that hit New Orleans in September and October 1918, was the deadliest. A third, less severe wave would follow in early 1919. The second wave was the most terrifying, striking down thousands in a matter of weeks, creating a profound sense of panic and despair. The sheer volume of sickness and death brought the city to a standstill. Businesses struggled and essential services faltered as workers fell ill. The city's morgue and cemeteries were overwhelmed, reminiscent of the worst days of yellow fever. The epidemic in New Orleans lasted for several intense months, with its peak in the fall of 1918. By the time the various waves finally receded, human cost was immense. In a city with a population of approximately 380,000 residents, Spanish flu claimed an official toll of nearly 3,500 lives. Historians often estimate the true number was significantly higher, possibly reaching 6,000 to 7,000 deaths, due, as usual, to underreporting, particularly among marginalized communities, and deaths attributed to pneumonia without specific flu testing. This means New Orleans lost approximately 1 to 2% of its population to the pandemic, a devastating blow to a city already grappling with the aftermath of World War I. It was a tragedy that touched nearly every family. The lasting mark of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 on New Orleans was profound, though perhaps less visibly etched into its architecture than the Great Fire or its public health initiatives as yellow fever. Firstly, it was a stark reminder that even in the early 20th century, with all its scientific advancements, humanity remained vulnerable to microscopic threats. Spanish flu forced a reckoning with the limitations of medical science at the time and spurred further investment in virology, epidemiology, and public health infrastructure. It reinforced the importance of quick, coordinated responses to infectious diseases, a lesson that cities like New Orleans had to learn the hard way. Secondly, it impacted the city's demographic makeup and its social fabric. The loss of so many young, productive individuals created social disruptions and economic hardship. The widespread closure of businesses and schools, the isolation, and the constant fear left a psychological scar on the survivors. The experience of living through such a pervasive, indiscriminate killer fostered a sense of collective trauma, even if it was not always openly discussed in the years that followed. While there might not be specific ghost stories attributed directly to the Spanish flu, as there are for yellow fever, the sheer volume of souls lost during this period would certainly contribute to the city's rich, complex spiritual landscape. For a place where the veil between worlds is already thin, the spirits of those who succumbed to the Spanish flu, their final breaths ragged, their bodies turning blue, surely linger, adding to the chorus of spectral whispers in the night. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was a global tragedy that, like all major historical calamities, left its unique imprint on New Orleans. We have journeyed through centuries of New Orleans struggles, from consuming fires and fierce battles to insidious plagues like yellow fever, cholera, and the Spanish flu. Each event etched itself into the city's soul, a testament to its enduring spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. But as we move closer to the present day, we encounter a catastrophe that, while born of natural forces, unleashed a level of devastation and despair that many believed would be the final crushing blow. We are talking about Hurricane Katrina, the monster storm of August 2005, an event that did not just mark the city, but nearly erased it. Imagine New Orleans in late August 2005. It is a city basking in the glow of its unique culture, its music, its food, its unyielding joie de vivre. The summer humidity hangs heavy, but life hums with its characteristic rhythm. For generations, residents had lived with a constant low-level anxiety of hurricane season. They had heard the warnings, seen the storm tracks, and performed the familiar rituals of preparation or evacuation countless times. This time, however, the warnings would be different. This time, the fear would be chillingly justified. Hurricane Katrina did not simply appear out of nowhere. It began its life as Tropical Depression 12 over the Bahamas on August 23, 2005. It strengthened rapidly, making landfall in Florida as a Category 1 hurricane, causing damage, but nothing catastrophic. However, the true terror began when Katrina emerged into the superheated waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Over the next 48 hours, it underwent a process known as rapid intensification, exploding in strength to a monstrous Category 5 hurricane with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. This rapid growth, fueled by exceptionally warm Gulf waters, transformed it into one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. The track of the storm was agonizingly clear, a direct bullseye on New Orleans. For days, meteorologists issued increasingly dire warnings. Local and federal officials urged, then mandated, a mass evacuation. But for many, especially the city's poorest, the elderly, and those without transportation, evacuation was not an option. They were left behind, clinging to the hope that New Orleans' notoriously fragile levee system would hold, or that once again, the city would be spared the worst. Katrina made its second landfall on August 29, 2005, just east of New Orleans, near Buras Triumph, Louisiana, as a powerful Category 3 hurricane. While its direct impact as a Category 5 was spared, its sheer size and the immense storm surge it pushed ahead of it were catastrophic. The storm raged over the region for hours, its outer bands pummeling the city with torrential rain and tropical storm-forced winds, eventually giving way to the truly devastating consequences. The immediate impact of the wind and rain was severe, tearing roofs, felling trees, and knocking out power. But it was the water, the insidious and overwhelming flood, that would become the true villain of the story. New Orleans sits precariously below sea level, a bowl protected by a complex system of levees and floodwalls. This system, designed to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, was tragically flawed and poorly maintained. The storm surge, far exceeding the capacity of the aging infrastructure, caused catastrophic breaches in at least 50 of the city's levees and floodwalls. The most infamous failures occurred along the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal. As these walls gave way, the waters of Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf of Mexico poured into the city. Within hours, 80% of New Orleans was submerged, much of it under 10 to 15 feet of toxic, sewage-filled water. The city, as residents would later describe, became an inland sea. The hurricane itself passed within a day, but the flooding was not effectively addressed for days, and in some areas, weeks. The immediate aftermath was a hellscape of stranded residents, desperate cries for help from rooftops, and a complete breakdown of infrastructure and emergency services. The Superdome, designated as a shelter of last resort, quickly devolved into a humanitarian crisis, overflowing with tens of thousands of people trapped without adequate food, water, or sanitation. The convention center became another horrifying scene of abandonment and despair. For days, the world watched in horror as one of America's great cities drowned, its citizens left to fend for themselves amidst the rising waters and decaying bodies. The cleanup and recovery would last not just months, but years, with some parts of the city still bearing scars 2 decades later. The human cost of Hurricane Katrina was immense and heartbreaking. Officially, the storm and its aftermath claimed over 1,800 lives across the Gulf Coast, with more than 1,500 of those deaths occurring in Louisiana, primarily in New Orleans. These were not just statistics. They were individuals, parents, children, grandparents who perished from drowning, injuries sustained during the storm, dehydration, heat stroke, or the sheer stress and medical neglect in the aftermath. The disproportionate impact on the elderly and the poor became a painful indictment of systemic inequalities. Beyond the immediate deaths, countless lives were irrevocably altered by displacement, trauma, and the loss of everything they owned. The lasting mark of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans is etched deeply into its very fabric, both physical and psychological. Firstly, it forced a complete reevaluation of the city's infrastructure and flood protection. The federal government invested billions of dollars in building a vastly improved, more robust levee and floodwall system designed to withstand a 100-year storm event. This monumental engineering feat was a direct, hard-won lesson from Katrina, a tangible manifestation of the city's resolve never to drown again. Secondly, the storm sparked a profound, often painful demographic shift. Many residents, especially African Americans, were permanently displaced, altering the racial and socioeconomic makeup of the city. While many eventually returned, the community ties were strained, and the fabric of traditional neighborhoods was irrevocably changed. The struggle for rebuilding became a battle for the soul of the city, balancing preservation with progress, ensuring that the new New Orleans honored its past while building a more equitable future. Culturally, Katrina solidified New Orleans' identity as a city of unparalleled resilience, often against the odds and sometimes against its own government. The New Orleans spirit became a global symbol of perseverance, creativity, and the power of community. The trauma of the storm became a recurring theme in the city's vibrant artistic expression. Music, literature, and visual arts, all grappling with the loss, memory, and renewal. It also amplified the city's already strong spiritual traditions. In a place where death is so often confronted, Katrina added a new layer of collective grief and ancestral memory, reinforcing the belief in a thin veil between the living and the dead. The waters receded, but the stories and perhaps the spirits of those lost in the flood forever became part of the city's eternal haunting. Hurricane Katrina was more than just a hurricane. It was a test of engineering, of government response, and most profoundly, of human spirit. It revealed the best and worst of humanity, but ultimately it highlighted the unyielding, defiant heart of New Orleans. The memory of those churning waters, the cries of the stranded, and the silence of the submerged city will forever be part of its story, adding a raw, visceral layer to the legends and echoes of the past that permeate every street, every alley, every soul in the Crescent City. And so, fellow seekers, we conclude our somber journey through the annals of New Orleans' past, a city that has faced down rampaging hurricanes, doused the flames of raging fires, overlooked differences and banded together to battle invaders, and endured the silent, unseen enemies of disease. The stories we have unearthed today of Hurricane Katrina's fury, the strategic clashes of the Battle of New Orleans, the devastating sweeps of yellow fever, cholera, and the Spanish flu, and the consuming inferno of the Great Fire of 1788, remind us of the immense resilience carved into the spirit of this legendary place. New Orleans, a city that has stared death in the face countless times, continues to thrive, its vibrant culture an eternal testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and rebuild. These tales of tragedy, resilience, and the enduring echoes of history resonated with you? Please show your support. Like this episode, share it with fellow seekers, and subscribe to Seekers of Otherworldly and Unknown Legends, wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Do not forget to visit our website at soulseekersunknown.com for more deep dives into the unknown. We absolutely love hearing from you. So if you have questions, stories you would like to share, or ideas for future content, reach out to us at soulfilearchives@gmail.com. Your insights fuel our journey into the weird and wonderful. Until next time, keep seeking the truth behind the legends.